Hello everybody. In this module we will be discussing a common argument for the position that a person should believe in God. This makes a good introductory argument to the section on God's existence, but you should notice that I said argument for the position that a person should believe in God, not argument that God exists. In this case, that is one thing that makes Pascal's wager a bit different from the others that we will be covering in the next few modules. If this distinction isn't immediately clear to you, it hopefully will become so throughout this piece. Blaise Pascal was a French scientist and mathematician who lived in the mid-17th century, from 1623 to 1663. He was also a Christian theologian famous for the argument we are to cover today. As with any argument, this argument requires premises in order to reach a conclusion. Here are the premises of Pascal's wager. First, we don't know whether or not God exists, but either God does in fact exist or he does not exist. One or the other must be true. That is an important one. This argument is an argument for the belief in God from a position of not just total uncertainty, but void of any real reason at all to believe that God might exist. Second, we are forced by circumstances to bet on whether or not God exists because according to Christianity, or at least many sects of Christianity, belief in God is required for salvation. This means that if we withhold judgment, we are essentially betting that God doesn't exist, since it would have the same outcome as disbelieving if it turns out that he does exist. So given these premises, Pascal asks us whether it is more rational to decide to believe that God exists or that God does not exist, and that is the question that we will be exploring here. Well, as Pascal sees it, there are basically four possibilities. God can either exist or God cannot exist. One can either believe in God or we cannot believe in God. We cannot choose whether or not God exists, but only whether or not we believe in God, so we can figure out the relative payoffs for each row. If we believe in God and God exists, then according to Pascal, our reward is infinite. That's to say, infinite pleasure in heaven. But what if we're wrong and God really doesn't exist? After all, this argument is working from the starting point of having no reason to believe in God at all. Well, in that case, then we have basically lived a good and moral life. We may have sacrificed some enjoyments, say missing the Super Bowl to attend church, or maybe avoiding certain carnal pleasures and the like, but it isn't a torturous life. What if, on the other hand, we do not believe? That's to say, what if we lock ourselves into this row? Well, if God exists, then according to Pascal, we suffer infinite pain in hell. Not all sects of Christianity believe in hell, of course, but many do, and this was Pascal's assumption. If, on the other hand, we do not believe, and we are right that God does not exist, we may gain a few more minor and base pleasures. To evaluate how we should bet, according to this reasoning, just look at the rows. An infinite number minus an infinite number is still infinite, so the total average payoff for belief in God is infinitely high. On the other hand, the total expected payoff for disbelief is infinitely negative. Of course, this chart doesn't show the odds of God existing, which would be important for most bets, but the payoffs in this case are infinite. Even if one believes that the odds of God existing are 10 billion against, infinity divided by a billion is still infinity. So one should bet that God exists, according to this reasoning. To determine if something is a good bet, we generally engage in cost-benefit analysis. The expected payoff of a bet is its reward multiplied by its odds. Even if the chances of God existing are unlikely, if it is at least finitely unlikely, then the expected payoff is infinite for believing. This is because any finitely small number multiplied by infinity is still infinite. For example, if you estimate the chances of God existing at a trillionth of 1%, the expected payoff is still mathematically infinite. Likewise, the risks of not believing are infinitely bad by the same reasoning. Pascal's wager, however, has a large number of problems. We will go through a few of them here. The first brings us back to a point that I made in the beginning. It turns out that a major problem with Pascal's wager is that, though Pascal's wager is often used as an argument for God's existence, that is not what it is. Pascal is not giving an argument that God likely exists. Pascal is instead giving an argument that it is prudent for us to believe in God just in case he does exist. If you look at the argument, there's no reason at all given to suppose that God does exist. The argument instead says that your expected payoff is better if you believe in God than if you do not. So fundamentally, Pascal's wager is not an argument about what is true. It doesn't even hint at what is true. It is a cost-benefit analysis of a particular belief. So we could theoretically follow this argument and agree with it, and yet have no reason to believe that it is true that God exists. Problem 2. How can we just believe? Since Pascal's wager doesn't give us any reason at all to suppose that God does exist, how is it that we can decide to believe in God? Does it make any sense, for example, to say, God probably doesn't exist, the odds are against it, but I believe that God exists? The first clause is saying that God probably doesn't exist, so if one believes that, it doesn't make sense to also think that he, she, or it probably does exist, much less definitely exists. Or think of it another way. What if I offered you $1 million if you would genuinely believe in leprechauns? Now, of course, you could say, I believe in leprechauns and now give me my money, but could you actually make yourself believe? It doesn't seem likely. You could pretend like you believe. You could do things that leprechaun believers might do, such as hunt for pots of gold by chasing rainbows, but you couldn't simply make yourself believe it is true like you can make yourself, say, walk across a room. The counter-argument proposed here is that though Pascal is giving us advice, it is advice that we cannot just choose to follow unless we think that the reasons are good enough, in which case we wouldn't need Pascal's argument in the first place to believe in God. Pascal's wager is made even more problematic in this regard because God, under his conception, is all-knowing. It isn't as if we can just fool God into thinking we believe. Pascal does try to anticipate this objection. He thinks that by going through the motions of acting like one believes, one will eventually come to believe. We can take this further by thinking about technology that could cause belief. So the possible defense is that, perhaps with enough effort, we can make ourselves believe. That's to say, brainwash ourselves into thinking that something we normally would not think is true. Here are some possibilities. We might be able to brainwash ourselves into believing through sheer force of will. People have psychological defense mechanisms that can make them believe or deny all sorts of things. Maybe we could force ourselves to believe with constant repetition, immediately pushing away doubt, and so forth until we do believe. Even if we can't make ourselves believe this way, maybe we can hire somebody to brainwash us. They can give us mind-altering drugs that weaken our defenses, and through mechanisms like hypnosis, force us to believe what we currently don't believe, given enough time. Even if the first two are impossible, it is possible that neurologists will eventually be able to program our neurons. It is at least theoretically possible that if we ask to be programmed to have a belief, that it could be done in the not too distant future. There are some real problems with this as a defense, however. Here are some relevant questions. Would God accept brainwashing ourselves as a way to make ourselves believe? Would that be real faith or real belief? Remember that God is supposed to be all-knowing under this conception. If genuine belief and faith was important to such a being, would that deity be happy with somebody who's basically saying, well, yeah, I think that God almost certainly doesn't exist, but I'm going to go through this process or procedure to short-circuit my normal belief process and force myself to believe something I currently think is false? For example, suppose that somebody could manufacture a pharmaceutical that caused people to believe in God. Would God be happy if people just took a faith pill because they thought that the existence of God was absurd without this pill and didn't want to risk hell in case the very unlikely event of God existing turned out to be true? Isn't this like trying to trick God with a loophole? Further, if we just refuse to question or analyze our beliefs because we're afraid of what we might discover, does this really even constitute much of a belief in the first place? Flat earthers, people living today who deny that the earth is round, for example, refuse to fly in planes because it might shake their faith. One therefore has to wonder how secure their belief can really be if they are essentially admitting that there is knowledge available that would undermine their belief. There's a third problem with Pascal's wager as well, and that is that there seems to be far more than two options available to us. That is to say that the wager presents us with a false dilemma. Pascal formulates his wager as if we have just two options. We can believe in God or not. But this doesn't seem to be true. Instead, our options are more like, we can believe in the Christian God that requires one to be a Catholic. We can believe in the Christian God that requires one to be a Mormon. We can believe in the Christian God that requires us to be blank, where the blank is filled in with the particulars of the more than 1,500 different sects of Christianity. We can believe in the Greek gods. We can believe in the Roman gods. We can believe in the blank gods, where the blank in this case is filled in by the deity of every other religion in the world, both presently and in the past, or in the future. So what is the reasoning here? Why should we pick one god or set of gods over another? Should we just go with the religion that threatens us with the worst afterlife, or which bribes us with the best one? But that isn't all. It gets worse. How can we rule out the possibility that God isn't accurately described in any current or pre-existing religion? Therefore, our choices also include, we believe in a pantheon of two gods that created the universe and demand such and such beliefs. We believe in a pantheon of three gods that created the universe and demand such and such beliefs. We believe in a pantheon of four gods that created the universe and demand such and such beliefs. And so you can see we have a literally infinite number of possibilities to choose from. If we have no reason to believe in God absent Pascal's wager, our expected payoff is now infinity divided by infinity, which is a number that doesn't make any sense. Infinity, as those of you who took calculus know, is not really a number, it is more of a process. So we can't even say that infinity over infinity is equal to 1, such as 2 over 2 or 5 over 5. In other words, unless there are some other reasons to believe that some specific God exists, Pascal's wager doesn't tell us which God to worship. But it gets even worse than this, much worse, because so far we've only been talking about gods that give a positive reward to believers. But remember, Pascal's wager doesn't tell us anything about God. Remember that we were absent any particular reason to believe. So here's another possibility. Maybe God exists, but the universe is a test to see if we use the gift of reason he gave us, and we are punished for not using this gift. God therefore punishes those who operate on faith and believe in him without good reasons, and actually rewards atheists. Just this option alone, absent any other reasons to believe, makes the non-believer payoff as strong as the believer payoff given Pascal's reasoning. What this means is that without a reason to believe in a very specific God, the atheist position is now as good as any other in terms of payoff. Pascal's wager can't differentiate between these two scenarios. The mere fact that one religion is more popular than another isn't a reason to believe it. That is a fallacy known in logic as the bandwagon or ad populum fallacy. The fourth problem we will discuss has to do with moral motivation. Let us suppose that God accepted self-induced brainwashing as genuine belief, and that we can in fact do such a thing. There's still a question about whether such a being would accept this kind of motivation for belief. Pascal's wager is trying to bribe and threaten us into belief. But heaven is supposed to be reward and hell a punishment. Suppose, for example, that the only reason why some person you know doesn't kill, maim, brutalize, steal, and tip over cows is because she's afraid that God will punish her in the afterlife if she does so. If this person didn't believe in God, she would do all of these things. Suppose that you know this for a fact in the same way that an all-knowing God could. Maybe the person even says things like, "Boy, I would really like to push that old lady down the stairs, but I'm trying to avoid hell, so I will not allow myself that pleasure." Or suppose that a person only believes because of the promise of a reward. This person says things like, "I would sure get a lot of enjoyment from setting that kitten on fire, but I'm sure I'll get even more enjoyment in heaven if I don't." Would God consider this kind of motivation good enough to get into heaven? If the answer is no, then this would also undermine Pascal's argument. There are other problems with Pascal's wager as well, such as questioning whether we are really risking as little as is being claimed by believing. We, after all, have only one life and an infinite amount of time to live, so sacrificing the quality of that life or intellectual integrity might not be such a small deal. As we try to do with all sections, we have here considered the back and forth between arguments and counter-arguments. I cannot point this out in every lecture, but I wish to remind students, because many feel strongly about these matters, that students are never graded on what they believe. They are graded on how well they understand the material, including theories and arguments, as well as the strength of any arguments they themselves put forward in essays and so forth. The goal of these lectures is to expose you to important philosophical arguments, and I have no axe to grind in terms of what beliefs you end up with. In terms of analyzing philosophy, however, I simply would not be doing a thorough job without covering some of the strongest arguments and counter-arguments for each section.